Sometimes a man can lose everything and still find his way home. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see past the mistakes to the heart underneath. Jack Morrison rode into Cedar Ridge with nothing but shame and 5 years of prison behind him. All he wanted was work for food, nothing more. Sarah Bennett was a widow struggling to save her ranch and raise her young son alone. When this broken cowboy knocked on her door, she could have turned him away like everyone else would. Instead, she gave him a chance. What started as simple labor became something deeper. But in a town that never forgets, can two damaged souls really build something new together? Would love be enough to overcome a past that refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust on the main street of Cedar Ridge never seemed to settle, kicked up as it was by wagon wheels, horses' hooves, and the restless wind that swept down from the mountains. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody else's business, where secrets lasted about as long as morning dew, and where a man's reputation followed him like his own shadow. Sarah Bennett stood at her kitchen window, watching the road through the thin cotton curtains her mother had sewn 20 years ago. Her hands, roughened by years of ranch work, gripped a coffee cup that had long gone cold. The morning sun cast long shadows across her property, illuminating the sagging fence posts and the barn that needed new shingles. Everything around her seemed to be falling apart piece by piece, like her life since David died. Her late husband's work gloves still hung on the peg by the kitchen door, brown leather worn smooth by years of honest labor. She couldn't bring herself to move them, couldn't bear to erase that last physical reminder of the man who'd built this place with his own 2 hands. Sometimes, in the early morning light, she'd catch sight of them and forget for just a moment that he was gone. "Mama, I'm hungry." Tommy's voice broke through her reverie. Her 8-year-old son stood in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from sleep, brown eyes so much like his father's that it sometimes took her breath away. "Course you are, little man." Sarah turned from the window and ruffled his hair. "How about some eggs and bacon? We got any bacon left?" The question hit her harder than it should have. They were down to their last few strips, and the chickens weren't laying like they used to. The banknote was due in 2 months, and she was still $50 short. $50 might as well have been $500 for all the chance she had of raising it. "We'll make do," she said, the way she always did. The way David used to say when times got hard, "We always do." Tommy nodded and padded back toward his room to get dressed. Sarah watched him go, her heart heavy with the weight of trying to be both mother and father to a boy who needed more than she could give. She'd turned down marriage proposals from 3 decent men in town, unable to imagine anyone taking David's place. But maybe that had been foolish pride. Maybe Tommy needed a father more than she needed to guard her heart. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road made her look up from the stove, where she was frying eggs. A lone rider approached slowly, and something about his posture cautious, almost apologetic made her pause. Most folks who came calling rode with purpose, heads high and confident. This man sat his horse like he was expecting to be turned away. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the front porch. The rider was close enough now that she could see he was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. His horse was a good one, though a bay mare, with intelligent eyes and careful steps. A man might be down on his luck, but if he treated his horse well, that said something about his character. He stopped at the edge of her property, touching the brim of his weathered hat. "Morning, ma'am." His voice was quiet, respectful. Sarah noticed he didn't ride right up to the house the way most men would. He was asking permission just by stopping where he did. "Morning," she replied, staying on the porch but not retreating inside. "Something I can help you with." The man dismounted, and she could see he moved carefully, like someone who'd learned that sudden movements weren't always welcome. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 35, with lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years and harder choices. "Yes, ma'am." "I hope so." He took a step closer but kept his distance, hat in his hands now. "Name's Jack Morrison. I'm looking for work. Just honest work, nothing more. I can fix fences, tend livestock, handle any kind of ranch work you might need doing." Sarah studied his face. There was something weary about him, something that reminded her of soldiers she'd seen returning from the Indian campaignsmen, who'd seen too much and carried it with them like invisible scars. "You hungry, Mr. Morrison?" The question seemed to surprise him. His jaw tightened slightly, and she saw pride war with need in his expression. Need won. "Yes, ma'am. I am." "Well, I was just making breakfast. You're welcome to share it if you don't mind working for your meal." Jack Morrison looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah had the strange feeling he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. Hope, maybe, or just simple human kindness. "That's more than fair, ma'am. What kind of work you need done?" "Call me Sarah, and there's always something needs fixing around here." She gestured toward the sagging fence line. "Fence posts need replacing, barn roof needs patching, and the horses could use someone with a gentle hand. My husband used to handle all that." She saw his eyes flick to the wedding ring still on her finger, understanding passing between them without words. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said simply. "Thank you." She paused, studying his face again. There was genuine sympathy there, not just polite words. "You can put your horse in the barn for now. Stalls empty on the left side." As Jack led his mare toward the barn, Sarah caught sight of her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, peering over the fence line that separated their properties. The older woman's expression was disapproving, her thin lips pursed like she'd tasted something sour. News of Sarah taking in a strange man would be all over town by noon. Let them talk, Sarah thought. She was tired of being careful, tired of living her life according to what other people thought was proper. This man needed help, and God knew she needed the work done around here. "Mama, who's that man?" Tommy appeared at her elbow, having seen the stranger from his bedroom window. "His name's Mr. Morrison. He's going to help us with some ranch work." "Is he staying?" The innocent question hit closer to home than Tommy could know. Sarah looked toward the barn where Jack was unsaddling his horse with practiced efficiency. His movements were economical, purposeful, a man who'd learned not to waste motion or time. "Just for a while, honey. Just until some things get fixed around here." But even as she said it, Sarah wondered if she was talking about more than fence posts and barn roofs. Something about Jack Morrison had stirred something in her that had been quiet for too long. Not attraction, not yet, but curiosity. Who was this man who asked for nothing but work and food? What had put those shadows in his eyes? Inside the barn, Jack Morrison ran his hands along his horse's neck and whispered words of gratitude. 5 years of concrete walls and iron bars had made him forget what kindness looked like. This woman Sarah had offered him breakfast like it was nothing, like feeding strangers was what decent people did every morning. He'd ridden into Cedar Ridge with no plan beyond finding work and moving on. He had $7 to his name and the clothes on his back, plus a horse that had been waiting for him when he walked out of Huntsville prison 3 days ago. His brother's guilty conscience, most likely, though the letter that came with the horse hadn't explained much. Now, looking around the barn at tools neatly hung and stalls that were clean despite their age, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not hope exactly, but its quieter cousin possibility. Maybe he could stay here long enough to earn some honest money. Maybe he could prove to himself that he was still the man he'd been before everything went wrong. The smell of bacon drifted from the house, and Jack's stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Prison food was fuel, nothing more. This would be different. This would be shared with people who didn't know his name or his history. For now, that was enough. For now, that was everything. For 7 days, Jack Morrison worked Sarah Bennett's ranch like a man trying to earn his way back into grace. He was up before dawn, tending to the horses and checking the cattle. He fixed 3 sections of fence, patched the barn roof where it leaked, and somehow coaxed the stubborn well pump back to life with nothing but patience and worn tools. Sarah found herself watching him work from the kitchen window. coffee cup in hand, as the sun painted the sky pink and gold. There was something almost reverent in the way he handled the animals, speaking to them in low, calm tones that seemed to settle even the most skittish horse. Tommy had taken to following Jack around like a lost puppy, pestering him with questions about horses and ranching and life in general. "Why don't you wear a gun belt like the other cowboys?" Tommy asked on the morning of the 7th day, perched on a fence rail while Jack repaired a gate hinge. Jack's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their work. "Don't need one for this kind of work." "But what if rustlers come? Papa always said a man should be able to protect what's his." "Your papa was a wise man." Jack tested the gate swing, adjusting the hinge until it moved smooth and silent. "But sometimes the best protection is just being the kind of man folks respect, not fear." Sarah, close enough to overhear from where she was hanging laundry, felt something warm settle in her chest. This stranger was teaching her son lessons about manhood that went deeper than gunfighting and bravado. David would have approved. But their peaceful routine shattered that afternoon, when Sheriff Bill Crawford rode up the dusty path to the house. Sarah's heart sank at the sight of his grim expression. Nothing good ever came from official visits. "Afternoon, Sarah." Crawford touched his hat brim, his eyes already scanning the property. "Need to have a word with you." "Course, Bill. Can I get you some coffee?" This isn't a social call. His gaze found Jack, who had stopped work on the corral and was walking over with measured steps. "That him?" Sarah's blood went cold. "That's who?" "Jack Morrison." Crawford's voice carried the weight of authority and suspicion. "Got a telegram yesterday from down in Austin. Seems we got ourselves a former resident of Huntsville prison working your ranch." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked at Jack, searching his face for denial, for explanation, for anything that would make this not be true. But his expression told her everything. The shame, the resignation, the weary acceptance of a man who'd been running from his past and finally been caught. "Is it true?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Jack met her eyes directly, and she saw something break behind his calm facade. "Yes, ma'am. It's true." Tommy looked between the adults, confusion and fear mixing on his young face. "Mama, what's happening?" Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Jack Morrison, you served 5 years for armed robbery. Stagecoach outside of San Antonio. Driver got shot, nearly died." "I didn't shoot anyone." Jack's voice was quiet, but firm. "Never even drew my gun." "Tell that to the jury that convicted you." Crawford's tone was harsh. "Sarah, you can't have this man around your boy, around decent folks. I should have been told the minute he set foot on your property." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. 7 days. 7 days of watching this man work with dedication and kindness, of seeing Tommy laugh again, of feeling something like hope creeping back into her life. "And now, you lied to me." The words came out flat, emotionless. Jack flinched as if she'd struck him. "I never lied to you. You never asked." "Don't pass words with me." The anger came sudden and fierce, born of hurt and betrayal. "You let me trust you. You let my son—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Mrs. Bennett," Crawford interrupted, "I need you to think carefully about this. This man is dangerous. He's got no business being around your family." But even as Sarah's heart pounded with shock and anger, part of her mind was working, remembering, the way Jack had been so careful around her and Tommy. The way he'd refused to wear a gun, had spoken about respect instead of fear. The way he'd looked when she'd offered him breakfast that first morning like kindness was something he'd forgotten existed. "What exactly did you do?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Jack glanced at Crawford, then back at her. "I was with 3 other men. We stopped a stage, took the strongbox. The driver went for his gun, and my cousin Billy panicked and shot him. I tried to stop the bleeding, tried to help him while the others ran. So you stayed with the victim until help came. Then I got arrested alongside him." Jack's jaw tightened. Billy was 19 and scared. If I'd testified against him, he'd have hanged. So I kept my mouth shut and took what the judge gave me. Crawford snorted. pretty story. You expect us to believe you're some kind of hero." "I don't expect anything," Jack said quietly. "I just told you what happened." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. The man she'd come to know over the past week, gentle with horses, patient with Tommy, respectful toward her. Was he real? Or had she been fooled by a practiced deceiver? "I think you should go," she said finally. Something died in Jack's eyes, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'll get my things." "Hold on there." Crawford stepped between Jack and the barn. "I'm thinking maybe you need to come with me. Answer some questions about what you've been doing since you got out." "He's been working," Sarah said sharply. 7 days straight, honest work." "Sarah." "Don't Sarah me, Bill Crawford. I may be angry at this man, but I'm not blind. He's worked harder than any hand I've ever hired, and he's been nothing but respectful to me and my son." Crawford looked surprised by her defense of Jack, but his expression remained stern. "That doesn't change what he is." "What he was," Sarah corrected. "What he was 5 years ago." Jack had been standing silently through this exchange, and now he stepped forward. "Sheriff, if you've got questions, I'll answer them. But Mrs. Bennett doesn't need any more trouble on account of me." He turned to Sarah, his hat in his hands again like that first morning. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "Doesn't matter what I thought. You deserve to know." Tommy, who had been silent through the whole confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "But he's been nice to us, Mama. He taught me how to curry the horses proper, and he fixed my wooden horse when it broke." The simple innocence of the boy's words seemed to hang in the air. Sarah looked at her son, then at Jack, then at Crawford, with his hand still hovering near his gun. "I want to know the whole truth," she said finally. "All of it, every detail of what happened 5 years ago, and every day since you got out of prison." Jack nodded. "You have that right." "Not here." She glanced meaningfully at Tommy. "Tonight, after supper. You can sleep in the barn one more night, and tomorrow—" She paused, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. "Tomorrow, we'll decide what happens next." Crawford's face darkened. "Sarah, this is foolish. You're putting yourself and the boy at risk." "That's my decision to make." Her voice carried a firmness that surprised even her. "He's been here a week without causing any harm. One more night won't make a difference." After Crawford left with dark mutterings about women who wouldn't listen to reason, Sarah found herself alone with Jack for the first time since the revelation. Tommy had been sent inside to do his schoolwork, leaving the two adults facing each other across a chasm of broken trust. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked again, more quietly this time. Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring at his boots. "Because I knew this would happen. I knew you'd look at me different, and I wasn't ready for that yet." "So, you were planning to lie forever?" "I was planning to move on before it mattered." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I never meant to stay this long. Never meant to—" He gestured helplessly. "I just wanted to work for my meals and move on down the road." "What changed?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. Sarah saw something vulnerable flicker across his features before he shuttered it away. "You gave me a chance," he said simply. "First time in 5 years someone looked at me like I might be worth something." The honesty in his voice hit her harder than his deception had. Sarah felt her anger wavering, replaced by something more complicated. This man had lied to her, yes. But he'd also worked harder than anyone she'd hired, had been gentler with her son than some of Tommy's own relatives. "Tonight," she said, "after Tommy goes to bed, I want the whole truth. You'll have it." As Jack walked back toward the barn, Sarah noticed the newspaper clutched in her hand, the latest edition of the Cedar Ridge Gazette that Crawford had brought with him. The headline caught her eye. "Local widow employs ex-convict." Somehow, word had already spread. By tomorrow, the whole town would be talking. She looked toward the barn where Jack was probably packing his few belongings, then at the house where Tommy sat at the kitchen table, confused and worried about the only father figure he'd known since David died. One more night, one conversation to learn the truth about Jack Morrison. Then she'd have to decide whether redemption was possible or if some mistakes were too big to overcome. The evening couldn't come fast enough. and yet she dreaded it with every fiber of her being. The broken fence post lay splintered in the morning grass, victim of a restless bull who decided the neighbor's pasture looked greener. Jack hefted the new post he'd cut from the stand of oak behind the barn, setting it carefully in the hole he'd dug before dawn. His movements were methodical, practiced, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he worked. 3 days had passed since Sheriff Crawford's visit. 3 days since the truth about Jack's past had shattered the comfortable routine they'd built. The evening conversation Sarah had demanded never happened. Tommy had taken sick with a fever that first night, and by the time he was well enough to leave his mother's side, something had shifted between the adults. The urgent need for truth had settled into a watchful coexistence. Jack stayed. Sarah let him. Neither spoke about it directly. "Mr. Jack!" Tommy's voice carried across the yard as he ran from the house, his energy fully restored after his brief illness. "Mama says to tell you there's coffee if you want some." Jack paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "That's kind of her. Tell her I'll be in directly." But Tommy didn't run back to the house. Instead, he plopped down in the grass, watching Jack work with the intense fascination only an 8-year-old could muster. "Sheriff Crawford says you're dangerous," Tommy said matter-of-factly. Jack's hands stilled on the fence post. "What do you think?" "I think Sheriff Crawford's got a stick up his." "Tommy." Sarah's voice carried a warning as she approached with a steaming mug of coffee. "Language." "Sorry, Mama." Tommy grinned, unrepentant. "But he does walk funny." Despite everything, Jack found himself smiling. The boy had a point. Crawford did have a perpetual stiffness that suggested chronic discomfort with his own authority. Sarah handed Jack the coffee, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. Neither pulled away immediately, and Jack felt that familiar flutter of something he had no right to feel. "Fence looks solid," Sarah said, stepping back to examine his work. "Should hold against anything short of a tornado." Jack tested the post's stability, then reached for his tools. "That bull of yours has some opinions about property lines." "That bull's been nothing but trouble since the day David bought him." Sarah's voice carried a mix of exasperation and fondness. "David always said he had more personality than sense." It was the first time she'd mentioned her late husband without the careful distance she usually maintained around the subject. Jack glanced at her face, seeing something softer there than the guarded expression she'd worn since Crawford's visit. "Sounds like he was a good man," Jack said quietly. "He was." Sarah's eyes found the fence line David had built, still straight and true after all these years. He had plans for this place. Big dreams about raising the finest cattle in 3 counties. What happened to those plans? Life. The word came out heavier than Sarah intended. "He got thrown from his horse 2 years ago, broke his neck." She paused, watching Tommy chase a grasshopper through the tall grass. Dreams don't mean much when you're trying to keep the bank from taking everything. Jack absorbed this information silently. He'd wondered about the financial strain he could see in the ranch's deferred maintenance, in Sarah's careful rationing of supplies, in the worry lines around her eyes when she thought no one was looking. "How much time do you have?" he asked. Sarah looked surprised by the directness of the question. 6 weeks, maybe 7, if I can convince the banker to extend the note. And if you can't, then Tommy and I start over somewhere else." She tried to keep her voice matter-of-fact, but Jack caught the tremor underneath. "Maybe go stay with my sister in Austin until I can find work." Jack knew about starting over, about losing everything and having to build a life from nothing. But he also knew something else, something about hard work and determination, and the kind of stubbornness that kept a person going when everything seemed hopeless. "What if you didn't have to?" "What do you mean?" Before Jack could answer, the sound of hoofbeats on the road drew their attention. A well-dressed man on a fine bay horse was approaching the house, his posture radiating self-importance and authority. Jack recognized the type, someone who'd never worked with his hands but held power over those who did. "That's Mr. Garrison," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "From the bank." Even from a distance, Jack could see the man's disapproving expression as he took in the scene, Sarah talking familiarly with a ranch hand, Tommy playing in the dirt like a common farm boy. Everything about Garrison's bearing suggested a man who believed in proper order and social boundaries. "Mrs. Bennet," Garrison dismounted with the careful movements of someone unused to actual ranch work. "I trust you received my letter about the accelerated payment schedule." Sarah's face went pale. "Accelerated schedule? Mr. Garrison, we agreed on 6 weeks. That was before certain information came to light about your choice of employees." Garrison's cold gaze swept over Jack, taking in his worn clothes and calloused hands. "The bank cannot be associated with individuals of questionable character." Jack felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd dealt with men like Garrison before, men who wielded power like a club and thought themselves above the dirt and sweat that actually built things. "Mr. Morrison's character is not the bank's concern," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear Jack could see in her eyes. "Everything on this property is the bank's concern until the note is satisfied." Garrison pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I'm afraid we must insist on full payment within 2 weeks, Mrs. Bennet. If you cannot comply, we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." The paper fluttered in the morning breeze as Sarah took it with trembling hands. Jack watched her scan the contents, saw her shoulders sag as she absorbed the impossible demand. 2 weeks, she repeated numbly. "I'm sorry it's come to this, but the bank's reputation must be protected." Garrison remounted his horse with the satisfaction of a man who'd delivered an unpleasant but necessary message. "Perhaps you should consider my previous offer. A woman alone shouldn't be trying to run a ranch anyway." After Garrison rode away, Sarah stood staring at the letter in her hands. Jack could see her fighting back tears, her whole body rigid with the effort of maintaining composure in front of Tommy. "What's he mean about his previous offer?" Jack asked gently. "He wants to buy the ranch." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "For about half what it's worth. Says he's doing me a favor, taking it off my hands before I lose everything." Jack felt something cold and hard settled in his chest. He'd seen this before, powerful men squeezing desperate people until they had no choice but to surrender everything they'd worked for. "That's not happening," he said with quiet conviction. Sarah looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Jack, you don't understand. 2 weeks, there's no way I can raise that kind of money." "Maybe not the usual way." Jack picked up his tools, his mind already working. "But there might be other options." "What kind of options?" Jack met her eyes, seeing the trust and fear warring there. "Let me worry about that. Right now, you've got a ranch to run, and I've got fences to fix." That evening, as Sarah tucked Tommy into bed, the boy asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. "Mama, are we really going to lose the ranch?" Sarah smoothed his dark hair, so like David's, and tried to find words that would be honest without being terrifying. "I don't know, sweetheart. But whatever happens, we'll face it together." "Mr. Jack won't let them take our home," Tommy said with the absolute confidence of childhood. "He's strong, and he's smart, and he cares about us." After Tommy fell asleep, Sarah sat on the front porch, the bank's letter still clutched in her hands. The numbers didn't change no matter how many times she read them. 2 weeks. Impossible. Jack emerged from the barn, his work finally done for the day. He hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps, as if asking permission to join her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Sarah gestured to the wooden chair David had built during their first summer on the ranch. "You've earned the right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through grass, an owl calling from the old oak tree. "I meant what I said earlier," Jack said finally, "about other options." "What kind of options could an ex-convict ranch hand possibly have that I don't?" Jack was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "Sometimes a man learns things in the dark places of his life that serve him well when he's trying to walk in the light." Sarah studied his profile in the moonlight, seeing something dangerous and determined in the set of his jaw. "Jack, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," he said carefully, that men like Garrison count on folks being too decent to fight back the way he fights, too honest to use his own tactics against him. You're talking about doing something illegal. I'm talking about doing something necessary. Jack turned to face her fully. That man is stealing your ranch, Sarah. Just because he's doing it with papers and legal words doesn't make it any less theft. The conviction in his voice both thrilled and terrified her. Here was a man willing to risk everything to protect what mattered to her. But the cost? I won't let you throw your life away for us, she said firmly. You've already paid enough for other people's choices. Jack reached over and gently took the letter from her hands, his fingers warm against hers. Some things are worth the risk. In the distance, a coyote howled, wild and free under the vast Texas sky. Sarah looked at this man who'd brought hope and danger in equal measure into her life, and realized that her heart had already made a choice her mind wasn't ready to accept. 2 weeks. Somehow they would find a way. They had to. The wooden horse lay in pieces on the kitchen table, victim of Tommy's over-enthusiastic play and a loose leg joint that had finally given way. Sarah watched as Jack examined the broken toy with the same careful attention he'd given to everything else around the ranch. "Can you fix it?" Tommy asked, hovering at Jack's elbow with the anxious expression of a boy whose favorite possession was in jeopardy. "Let me see what I can do." Jack turned the pieces over in his hands, studying the grain of the wood and the way it had been carved. "This is good work. Someone took their time making this." "Papa made it for my 5th birthday," Tommy said proudly. "Mama says he worked on it for weeks, getting the legs just right so it would stand proper." Jack's hands stilled for a moment, and Sarah saw something shift in his expressiona recognition of the weight he held. This wasn't just a toy. It was one of the few tangible connections Tommy had to his father. "Well then, we'd better make sure it's good as new," Jack said quietly. "Maybe even a little better." Over the next hour, Sarah found herself watching Jack work from the kitchen window as she prepared supper. He'd set up at the workbench behind the barn, his movements precise and patient as he carved a new joint piece and sanded the rough edges smooth. Tommy sat beside him on an overturned bucket, chattering about horses and cattle and the complex social dynamics of 8-year-old boys. What struck Sarah most was how naturally Jack listened, never dismissing Tommy's concerns as childish or unimportant. When Tommy worried about starting school in the fall and whether the other boys would like him, Jack talked seriously about the difference between popularity and respect. When Tommy asked why his papa had to die, Jack was quiet for a long time before saying that sometimes good people were taken early because they'd already done what they were meant to do in the world. "Like what?" Tommy pressed. "Like raising a fine son and loving a good woman and building something that matters," Jack said, testing the repaired joint for stability. "That's more than a lot of men accomplish in twice as many years." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the gentle wisdom in Jack's words. David would have liked this man, she realized. Would have appreciated his quiet strength and the way he treated Tommy like a person worth knowing. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed clutching his perfectly repaired horse, Sarah found Jack on the front porch, as had become their habit. But tonight was different. Tonight, she brought 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey David had been saving for a special occasion that never came. "Seemed like the right time," she said, settling into a chair and pouring 2 modest measures. Jack accepted the glass with surprise. "What are we drinking to?" "Second chances." Sarah raised her glass, meeting his eyes in the lamplight. "And to men who take the time to fix broken things." They drank in comfortable silence, the whiskey warming Sarah's chest and loosening some of the tension she'd carried since Garrison's visit. 2 weeks had become 10 days, but somehow the impossible deadline felt less crushing with Jack beside her. "Tell me about prison," she said suddenly. Jack nearly choked on his whiskey. "That's not exactly pleasant dinner conversation." "I need to know, if we're going to—" She stopped, realizing she'd almost said something that would change everything between them. "I need to understand what made you who you are." Jack stared into his glass for a long moment before speaking. "It's a place where you learn what you're really made of. Some men break, Some men get harder, and some men figure out what really matters. Which were you? All three, at different times. Jack took another sip of whiskey, the memories clearly painful. First year, I thought I'd die from the loneliness. Second year, I got angrier than I'd ever been in my life. Wanted to hurt everyone who'd put me there, everyone who'd failed me. What changed? Got a letter from my cousin Billy, the one whose mistake put me there. Jack's jaw tightened. He was getting married, starting a family, building a life, because I'd kept his name out of the trial. And I realized that's what I'd wanted all along. For him to have a chance I never got. Sarah studied his profile in the lamplight, seeing the pain he carried, but also the peace he'd made with his choices. Do you regret it, taking the blame for him? No. The answer came without hesitation. Billy was 19 and stupid. I was 28 and should have known better than to get mixed up with desperate men doing desperate things. But you didn't shoot anyone. Didn't stop anyone from getting shot either. Jack finished his whiskey and set the glass down carefully. Prison teaches you that intentions don't matter much. Actions do. Results do. They sat quietly for a while, the weight of shared confidences settling between them. Sarah felt something shifting in her chest, a wall she'd built around her heart, developing hairline cracks. Jack, she said softly, what you did for Billy, taking responsibility for someone else's mistake, that says something about your character. Or my stupidity. No. Sarah turned in her chair to face him fully. It says you're the kind of man who puts others before himself, the kind of man who understands what loyalty means. Jack looked at her then, really looked, and Sarah saw something vulnerable flicker in his eyes. Sarah, I need you to know something. What? What I said about having options for dealing with Garrison, I meant it. But I won't do anything without your blessing. I won't bring more trouble down on you and Tommy. The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. What kind of options? The kind that require me to visit some people I used to know, people who might have information about Garrison's business practices. Jack's voice was carefully neutral. Sometimes banks like his cut corners, bend rules. If a man knew where to look, he might find evidence of improprieties. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. You're talking about blackmail. I'm talking about justice. There's a difference. Is there? Really? Jack was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right to question it. 5 years ago, I might not have seen the distinction myself. And now I know the difference between taking something that doesn't belong to you and protecting something that does. Jack met her eyes steadily. This ranch belongs to you and Tommy. Garrison's trying to steal it with legal papers instead of a gun, but it's still theft. Sarah felt torn between hope and fear. The idea that there might be a way to save the ranch, to keep Tommy's inheritance intact, was intoxicating. But the cost, if you got caught, I'd go back to prison, probably for a long time. Jack's voice was matter-of-fact. But Tommy would grow up on his father's land, and you'd have the life you and David planned. The casual way he spoke of sacrificing his freedom for their future took Sarah's breath away. Jack, I can't let you. It's not your choice to make. He reached over and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. Some things are worth the risk. The warmth of his touch sent shivers up Sarah's arm. When had she started thinking of this man as more than just a hired hand? When had his presence become essential to her sense of safety and hope? There has to be another way, she whispered. Maybe, but if there isn't, if it comes down to losing everything or taking a chance, I want you to know I'm willing. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, hers pale and soft, despite the ranch work, his dark and scarred from years of hard labor and harder choices. Why? Why would you risk everything for people you barely know? Jack was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I'm home. The words hung in the night air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Sarah felt her heart racing, felt the careful distance she'd maintained crumbling like old mortar. Jack, I know it's not my place to say that. I know I'm just passing through, and you've got no reason to trust a man with my history. Jack released her hand and started to rise from his chair. I should let you get some rest. Wait. Sarah's voice stopped him halfway to standing. You're not just passing through. Sarah. You're not. She stood as well, stepping closer until she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. A man just passing through doesn't spend an hour fixing a broken toy horse, doesn't listen to an 8-year-old boy like his words matter, doesn't offer to risk his freedom to save a failing ranch. Jack's breath caught as she moved even closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and honest work, could see the pulse jumping in his throat. What are you saying? He asked quietly. I'm saying maybe it's time I stopped being so careful about protecting my heart from good men, just because I lost one bad. Sarah reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. I'm saying maybe Tommy needs a father figure who'll teach him about honor and sacrifice and fixing broken things. And what do you need? Jack's voice was rough with emotion. Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. I need to stop being afraid of second chances. When Jack kissed her, gentle and hesitant at first, then deeper as she responded, Sarah felt something she'd thought was buried with David come back to life. Not the same love that would always belong to her first husband, but something new and equally precious. We'll find another way, she whispered against his lips. Whatever it takes, we'll save the ranch without you having to go back to that place. Jack held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. Promise me something. What? If it comes down to choosing between the ranch and my freedom, choose the ranch. Choose Tommy's future. Sarah pulled back to look at him, seeing the resolve in his eyes. I won't have to choose. We'll find another way. But even as she said it, Sarah knew that 10 days might not be enough time for miracles, and if it came down to the choice Jack had outlined, she wasn't sure her heart could bear either option. From inside the house, Tommy called out in his sleep, dreaming of horses and adventures and the father figure who'd become the center of his world. Sarah listened to her son's peaceful breathing and made a silent vow. Whatever happened in the next 10 days, she would fight for this family, the one she'd lost and the one she was maybe brave enough to build again. The drought had come early that year, turning the grass brown and the creek beds to cracked earth. Sarah stood at the edge of what used to be their main water source, watching the last puddles shrink under the merciless sun. 8 days until Garrison's deadline, and now this nature conspiring with the banker to destroy everything David had built. Well's running dry too, Jack said, coming up behind her with his hat in his hands. Sweat stained his shirt, despite the early hour, testament to the heat that promised to be brutal by noon. Checked it this morning. Maybe 3 days of water left, if we're careful. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. Without water, the cattle would have to be sold immediately for whatever price they could get. Without the cattle, there'd be no hope of raising even a fraction of what they owed the bank. The Henderson place still has water, she said finally. Old man Patterson's well never runs dry. 20 miles to drive the herd. We'd lose half our weight in the heat, and the rest would be too stressed to bring good prices. Jack studied the barren landscape, his mind clearly working on the problem. Unless what? Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dry creek bed with an intensity that made Sarah nervous. She'd learned to read his expressions over the past weeks, and this one spoke of dangerous ideas taking shape. There's an old mining technique for finding underground water. Learned about it from a fellow in prison who used to work the silver mines in Colorado. Jack knelt down and scooped up a handful of dirt, letting it sift through his fingers. Sometimes what looks like barren ground is sitting right on top of an underground stream. You think there's water under here? I think this creek didn't just dry up something, redirected it. Jack stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. Question is what, and whether we can fix it. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. What would that involve? Digging, a lot of digging, and probably some blasting if we hit rock. Jack's expression grew serious. It's dangerous work, and there's no guarantee we'll find anything. But if we do, we might be able to restore the creek flow and save the cattle. Jack paused. Might even help the neighboring ranches. A man who brings water back to drought country tends to earn some goodwill. That afternoon, Jack rode out to survey the dried creek bed, while Sarah tended to the increasingly restless cattle. She found herself watching him from the kitchen window, noting how he moved across the landscape, like he was reading a book written in stone and soil. When Tommy came in for lunch, dusty from helping with the morning chores, he plopped down at the table with the dramatic exhaustion only children could muster. "It's too hot for anything," he declared. "Even the chickens are hiding in the shade." "Drink your water," Sarah said, setting a glass in front of him. "Every drop's precious now. Mr. Jack says he's going to find us more water, says there's rivers underground that nobody can see." Tommy gulped his water with the trust of a child who believed adults could solve any problem. "He knows about lots of things, doesn't he, Mama?" "Yes, he does." Sarah smoothed Tommy's sweaty hair, marveling at how completely her son had accepted Jack into their lives. "Tommy, what would you think if Mr. Jack stayed with us permanent-like?" Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "You mean like a real papa?" The simple question hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. "Would that make you happy?" "It'd make me the happiest boy in 3 counties. Tommy's grin faded slightly. "But what about Papa David? Would he mind?" Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at her son's innocent wisdom. "I think Papa David would want us to be happy, and he'd want you to have someone to teach you about being a good man. Mr. Jack already does that." Tommy finished his water and set the glass down carefully. "He says a man's word is his bond, and you should never make promises you can't keep." That evening, as the sun painted the sky red and gold, Jack returned from his survey with a grim expression and dirt under his fingernails. Sarah met him at the barn, reading his face in the fading light. "You found something," she said. "I found where the water went." Jack unsaddled his horse with mechanical precision, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. "About 2 miles upstream, someone built a dam. Small one, but enough to redirect the creek flow." Sarah's blood went cold. Who would do that? Someone who wanted to make sure certain ranches couldn't survive the drought. Jack's jaw was tight with controlled fury. Someone who might have advanced knowledge of when the bank was planning to foreclose. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Garrison. Can't prove it yet, but the timing's mighty convenient. Jack hung up the saddle and turned to face her. "Sarah, there's something else. I rode over to check on the Patterson place, see how they were managing the drought. And? Old man Patterson died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack, they think. His nephew from back east came out to settle the estate." Jack's expression grew even grimmer. "Guess who's been helping the nephew with the legal paperwork?" "Garrison." Sarah felt sick to her stomach. "He's been planning this for months, hasn't he? The accelerated payment schedule, the dam, buying up the surrounding properties when they fail." "Looks that way?" Jack stepped closer, his voice dropping to the gentle tone he used when delivering hard truths. "Sarah, even if we can prove what he's doing, it might not be in time to save the ranch. Legal processes move slow, and we've got 8 days. Sarah stared at the red dirt beneath her feet, the same dirt David had worked with his own hands, the same dirt that might slip through her fingers no matter how hard she fought to hold on to it. "So, what do we do?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something that caught the lamplight. Sarah's breath hitched as she recognized her late husband's wedding ring, the one she'd removed from David's finger before the burial and kept in a small box on her dresser. "Jack, what thou did you?" "Found it on your dresser this morning when I was fixing the window latch in your room." Jack held the ring out to her, his hand steady, despite the emotion in his voice. "I was going to just put it back, but then I got to thinking." Sarah took the ring with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of all the love and loss it represented. "Thinking about what?" "About what kind of man David Bennett must have been to earn the love of a woman like you, about what he'd want for his son and for his wife." Jack's voice grew rough with emotion. "About whether I'm worthy to even dream of taking his place." Sarah looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. "Jack, I know I'm not him. No, I can't give you the same life he would have, or be the same kind of father to Tommy." Jack's hands clenched at his sides. "But I can promise you this. I'll fight for this family with everything I have. I'll die before I let Garrison or anyone else take what belongs to you and Tommy." The raw honesty in his voice broke something open in Sarah's chest. She stepped forward and took his face in her hands, feeling the tension in his jaw, the rapid pulse in his throat. "David was a good man," she said softly. "But you're a good man too, Jack Morrison. Different, but good in your own way." She slipped David's ring into her apron pocket, and then, before she could lose her courage, reached up and pulled her own wedding ring from her finger. The simple gold band felt strange in her palm after 2 years of constant wearing. "I loved David Bennett with everything I had," she said, meeting Jack's eyes steadily. "And I'll always carry that love with me. But I'm ready to love again, ready to build something new." Jack's breath caught as she took his hand and pressed the ring into his palm. "Sarah, you don't have to." "I want to." She rose on her toes and kissed him softly, tasting hope and possibility on his lips. "Whatever happens with the ranch, whatever we have to face, I want to face it with you." When they broke apart, Jack rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if trying to memorize the moment. "We're going to save this place," he whispered fiercely. "Whatever it takes, however we have to do it, I won't let you down." From the house came the sound of Tommy practicing his letters, his young voice carefully sounding out the words in his primer. The ordinary domestic sound seemed to wrap around them like a promise, like a glimpse of the future they were fighting to protect. 8 days. They had 8 days to find a miracle, or create one themselves. But for the first time since Garrison's ultimatum, Sarah felt truly hopeful. Whatever came next, they would face it together as a family. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a postal rider whose somber expression told Sarah it contained news that would change everything. Jack was in the barn tending to a lame horse when she called his name, her voice carrying an urgency that brought him running. "It's from Austin," she said, holding the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. "From someone named William Morrison." Jack's face went white. "Billy. My cousin Billy." Sarah handed him the letter, watching his expression change as he read. She saw pain flicker across his features, then something that might have been relief, followed by a complicated mixture of emotions she couldn't quite read. "What does it say?" she asked gently. Jack sank down onto the porch steps, the letter still clutched in his hands. "He's confessing everything. The robbery, who really planned it, who pulled the trigger." His voice was rough with emotion. "Says he can't live with the guilt anymore, knowing I paid for his mistakes." Sarah sat down beside him, close enough to read over his shoulder. Billy's handwriting was careful, almost childish, but the words carried the weight of 5 years of carried shame. "Jack, I know this don't make up for what you lost, but I got to set things right. I've been living with this poison inside me for too long, and it's eating me alive. You took the blame for something that was my fault, and I let you because I was scared and stupid. But I got a wife now, and a baby coming, and I can't teach them about honor when I got none myself. I'm sending this letter to the sheriff in Cedar Ridge and copies to the judge who sentenced you and the newspaper in Austin. Everyone's going to know the truth about what happened that day, and maybe folks will see you for the good man you really are instead of the criminal they think you made yourself out to be. I know saying sorry don't give you back them 5 years, but I hope maybe it gives you back your good name. You always said a man's reputation was worth more than money, and I took that from you along with everything else. Your cousin, William Morrison." Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes as she finished reading. "Jack, this changes everything. People will know you were protecting him, that you're not the criminal they think you are." "It doesn't change what I did," Jack said quietly. "Doesn't change the fact that I was there, that someone got hurt because of choices I made. But it shows why you made those choices. It shows the kind of man you really are." Sarah took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and determination. "This letter proves what I already knew, that you're someone who puts family before yourself, who understands what loyalty means." Jack looked at her with something like wonder. You really see me that way? I see you the way Tommy sees you, as a man worth looking up to. The way the horses see you as someone they can trust. The way I see you as someone worth loving. Before Jack could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the road. Sheriff Crawford was approaching, but his usual stern expression had been replaced by something that looked almost like embarrassment. Morning, Sarah, Jack. Crawford dismounted with obvious reluctance. Got a letter in the mail yesterday. Figured I owed you both an apology. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, another copy of Billy's confession. Seems I was wrong about your character, Morrison. Takes a special kind of man to do what you did, protecting family like that. Jack stood slowly, his expression wary. Sheriff? No. Let me say this. Crawford's voice was gruff with discomfort. I've been wearing this badge for 15 years, and I pride myself on reading men's character. Should have seen that you weren't the kind to hurt innocent folks. You had every reason to be suspicious, Jack said simply. A man with a prison record shows up in your town. You'd be a fool not to watch him careful. Crawford nodded, but Sarah could see he was still struggling with his misjudgment. All the same, I owe you better treatment than you got from me. And I owe Sarah an apology for trying to tell her who she could and couldn't trust. Apology accepted, Sarah said firmly. What matters now is the truth is out. After Crawford left, promising to spread word around town about Billy's confession, Sarah found herself alone with Jack on the porch. The letter had changed something between them, not their feelings, but the possibility of a future together without the shadow of his past hanging over them. People will see you different now, she said. Some will, others, Jack shrugged. Some folks make up their minds about a person and never change them, no matter what evidence they're shown. As if summoned by his words, the sound of a buggy on the road announced the arrival of Sarah's sister, Margaret, her face set in the disapproving lines that had become familiar over the years. Margaret was 5 years older than Sarah and had never quite forgiven her younger sister for choosing love over security when she'd married David Bennett. Sarah, Margaret said coolly as she climbed down from her buggy. I came as soon as I heard about your situation. And what situation would that be? Sarah's voice carried a warning that Margaret chose to ignore. Living in sin with an ex-convict while your poor son watches. Margaret's sharp eyes found Jack, taking in his worn clothes and weathered hands with obvious distaste. Really, Sarah, even for you this is beyond the pale. Sarah felt her temper flare, but Jack's gentle hand on her arm kept her from saying something she might regret. Margaret, I'd like you to meet Jack Morrison. He's been helping with the ranch work. I know who he is. Margaret's tone could have frozen water in July. The whole county's talking about the widow Bennett and her criminal paramour. Then the whole county can mind its own business, Sarah said sharply. Margaret turned to Jack with the expression of someone addressing a particularly unpleasant insect. Mr. Morrison, surely you can see that your presence here is damaging to my sister's reputation and harmful to her son's development. A man with any decency would remove himself from the situation. Jack studied Margaret for a long moment, and Sarah could see him measuring his words carefully. Ma'am, with respect, I think that decision belongs to Sarah and her son. A child doesn't know what's best for him. That's why he has adults to make proper choices. Margaret's voice rose with righteous indignation. Sarah, you have a responsibility to that boy that goes beyond your own selfish desires. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Sarah felt doubt creep into her heart, the familiar guilt that came with every choice that put her own happiness into the equation. Was she being selfish? Was she risking Tommy's future for her own emotional needs? Jack must have seen the uncertainty in her face because he stepped back, creating physical distance that felt like an emotional chasm. Maybe your sister has a point, he said quietly. Maybe I should. No. The word came out stronger than Sarah felt, but once she'd said it, conviction followed. No, Margaret. You don't get to come into my home and tell me how to live my life. Sarah, You've been telling me what to do since I was 16 years old, and I'm done listening." Sarah moved to stand beside Jack, close enough that their shoulders touched. "This man has worked harder for my family than anyone since David died. He's been kind to my son, respectful to me, and honest about his past. If that's not good enough for the county gossips, that's their problem, not mine." Margaret's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You're making a mistake that will ruin you both." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Sarah reached for Jack's hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. "Tommy, come here, please." Her son appeared in the doorway, having obviously been listening from inside the house. His young face was solemn as he took in the tension between the adults. "Tommy, Aunt Margaret thinks Mr. Jack is bad for our family. What do you think?" Tommy looked between his aunt and Jack, his 8-year-old mind processing the adult complexities with surprising wisdom. "I think Mr. Jack makes Mama smile again. And he fixed my horse, and he's teaching me about being honorable. Papa David would like him." The simple honesty of the boy's words seemed to hang in the air. Margaret's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Children don't understand the complexities. Children understand love and kindness and safety," Sarah interrupted. "And Tommy feels all those things with Jack. That's what matters to me." After Margaret left with dire predictions about scandal and social ruin, Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the coffee cups on the table. The confrontation had drained her, left her questioning decisions she'd felt confident about just hours before. "She's not entirely wrong," Jack said from the doorway. "About the talk, I mean. About what it might cost you and Tommy." Sarah turned to face him, seeing the pain and uncertainty in his eyes. "Are you having second thoughts?" "I'm wondering if I'm being selfish, if wanting to stay here is more about what I need than what's best for your family." Sarah crossed the room and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palms. "What's best for my family is having someone who loves us, who'll fight for us, who'll teach Tommy what it means to be a good man. What's best for my family is being happy." Jack closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. "I love you, Sarah Bennett. Love you and Tommy more than I thought I could love anything." "Then stay. Fight with us. Help us save this ranch and build a life worth having." Sarah rose on her toes and kissed him softly. "Let the gossips talk. We'll give them something real to talk about." When they broke apart, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold David's wedding ring, the one Sarah had given him. But now it was paired with another ring, this one obviously new despite its simple design. "I rode into town this morning while you were doing laundry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Used the last of my money to buy this." Sarah stared at the two rings in his palmone, representing her past, one representing her future. "Jack, I know we can't have a proper wedding, not with everything that's happening, but I wanted you to know that whatever comes next, I'm committed to this family. To you and Tommy and whatever children we might have together." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she picked up the new ring, feeling its weight and warmth. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jack Morrison?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me, whatever that looks like, wherever it leads us." Jack took her hands in his, steady and sure. "Will you have me, Sarah? Ex-convict and all?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." As Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah felt something settle into place in her heart. They still had 6 days to save the ranch, still faced impossible odds and uncertain futures. But whatever came next, they would face it together. From the living room came the sound of Tommy playing with his wooden horse, the toy Jack had repaired with such careful attention. The simple domestic sound seemed to wrap around them like a blessing, like a promise of all the ordinary, precious moments that made up a life. 6 days. They had 6 days to find a miracle. But looking at the ring on her finger and the love in Jack's eyes, Sarah thought maybe they'd already found one. The discovery came by accident, the way most life-changing revelations do. Jack was reinforcing the kitchen wall, where years of settling had created a dangerous bow, when his pry bar punched through the plaster and struck something that rang like metal. Sarah, washing dishes at the sink, turned at the sound. What was that? Jack worked the pry bar carefully, enlarging the hole until he could peer inside. There's something in here. Looks like a metal box. It took 20 minutes of careful demolition to extract the tin container from its hiding place between the wall studs. The box was wrapped in oiled cloth and had been placed there deliberately, with care taken to protect it from moisture and time. Sarah dried her hands on her apron and joined Jack at the kitchen table as he carefully unwrapped their find. Inside the cloth was indeed a metal box, old but well preserved, with a simple clasp that opened at Jack's touch. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. The box contained papers, legal documents with official seals and careful handwriting. On top lay a letter in David's familiar script, addressed to "My beloved Sarah," in the flowing penmanship he'd learned from his mother. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, Jack reading over her shoulder as David's voice seemed to speak from beyond the grave. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've finally decided to make the improvements to the kitchen we always talked about. I should have told you about these papers before, but I wanted to surprise you with them on our 10th anniversary. The deed in this box is the original land grant for our property, not the copy we keep in the bank's safe deposit box, but the real one with the full legal description. When I bought this land from the territory, I discovered that the boundaries described in the original survey were wrong. Our property doesn't end at Willow Creek like we thought. It extends another half-mile north and includes the water rights to the spring that feeds the Patterson place. I had the survey corrected and filed the proper paperwork in Austin, but I never changed the deed we use for bank business. Figured it was better to let sleeping dogs lie until we needed the extra land. The spring rights alone are worth more than what we paid for the whole ranch. I also found something else interesting in the territorial records. There's a mining claim filed on our property from 1847, before the land was properly surveyed. According to the territorial law, mineral rights from that claim should have transferred with the land purchase, but they were never included in any of the deeds. The original prospector gave up and moved on, but he never formally abandoned his claim. I had a lawyer in Austin look into it. Turns out there's a good chance we own not just the land and water rights, but any mineral rights that were never properly transferred to subsequent buyers. It would take some legal work to prove, but if we ever needed money for improvements or emergencies, it might be worth pursuing. I love you, Sarah. I love our life and our son and the future we're building together. I just wanted to make sure you'd never have to worry about losing this place, no matter what might happen to me. Your devoted husband, David Bennett. P.S. The larger envelope contains the corrected survey maps and the territorial records I copied. Everything you need to prove our legal claim. Sarah's tears had begun falling before she finished the first paragraph. By the time she reached David's signature, she was sobbing not just from grief, but from a complex mixture of loss, love, and overwhelming relief. Jack sat quietly beside her, his arm around her shoulders as she processed what the letter meant. Finally, she looked up at him, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He was still taking care of us," she whispered, "even after he was still trying to protect us." "What does this mean for the ranch?" Jack asked gently. Sarah spread the documents on the table, her hands steadier now, as she examined the official seals and legal language. "It means we own more land than we thought. It means we own the water rights to the spring that's been keeping the Patterson place alive. And it means—" She stopped, studying one particular document more closely. "Jack, look at this." The paper was a territorial survey map, showing property boundaries in careful detail. Sarah traced her finger along the lines, comparing them to the deed Garrison had been using as the basis for his foreclosure proceedings. "Our property line doesn't end where Garrison thinks it does. According to this, the land he's been buying, up the Patterson place, the Miller homestead, even the spot where someone built that damel of it, is actually part of our original claim." Jack leaned closer, following her finger as she traced the boundaries. You're saying Garrison's been buying land that legally belongs to you? I'm saying Garrison's been buying land that was never legally separated from our original territorial grant. Sarah's voice grew stronger as understanding dawned. The territorial records David copied show that when the land was first surveyed, it was all one big parcel. The smaller deeds that created the individual homesteads were filed later, but they never properly accounted for the original boundaries. Jack studied the documents with the focused attention he brought to everything important. So, legally, we might own most of the land in this valley. The water rights, the mineral rights, everything. Sarah felt something between laughter and hysteria bubbling up in her chest. David was trying to tell me we were sitting on a fortune and didn't even know it. The implications were staggering. If the documents were legitimate and the territorial seals suggested they were, then Garrison's entire scheme was built on fraudulent land claims. The dam that had been diverting their water was built on property that belonged to them. The Patterson place that Garrison had been so eager to acquire was legally part of their ranch. Sarah, Jack said carefully, if this is true, it means Garrison knows about the territorial records. Has to know. A banker doesn't buy up property without checking the deed history. You think he's been planning this all along, not just the foreclosure, but I think he's been planning to acquire your land one way or another. And when he discovered David's research, he realized he needed to move fast. Jack's expression was grim. The accelerated payment schedule, the dam, buying up the surrounding properties, it's all been about getting control before you discovered what you really own. Sarah stared at the documents spread across her kitchen table, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of David's gift and the scope of Garrison's deception. How do we prove it? How do we stop him when he's got the law on his side? We take these documents to a lawyer, a real one, not someone in Garrison's pocket. Jack gathered the papers carefully, handling them like the precious evidence they were. But first, we need to make sure these are safe. If Garrison realizes what we found, he'll destroy them. Sarah finished the thought, understanding flooding through her. That's why he's been so eager to foreclose. He's not just after the ranch, Hayes, after these documents. Jack nodded grimly. Question is, how much does he already know? And how far is he willing to go to get what he wants? As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed sent them both to the window. Garrison was riding up to the house, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 men accompanied him, hard-looking individuals with guns on their hips and cold eyes that spoke of violence for hire. Sarah, Jack said quietly, take these documents and Tommy and go out the back door. Head for the barn and saddle your fastest horse. I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving me. You're protecting what matters most. Jack's voice was calm but urgent. If something happens to these papers, we lose everything. If something happens to you and Tommy, nothing else matters. Sarah grabbed the documents and stuffed them into the metal box, her heart pounding as the riders drew closer. What are you going to do? Buy you time. Jack checked the rifle David had kept above the fireplace, his movements efficient and practiced. And maybe find out exactly what Garrison knows. Jack. He turned and kissed her, hard, quick, and desperate. I love you. Now go. Sarah ran for Tommy's room, finding her son looking out the window with wide, frightened eyes. Mama, who are those men with Mr. Garrison? I don't know, sweetheart, but we need to leave right now. Sarah grabbed Tommy's hand and the metal box, leading him toward the back door. We're going to the barn, and then we're going for a ride. What about Mr. Jack? Mr. Jack will be fine. Sarah prayed she was telling the truth. He's very good at taking care of himself. From the front of the house came the sound of boots on the porch, followed by Garrison's voice, louder and more aggressive than she'd ever heard it. Mrs. Bennett, I know you're in there. We need to discuss the terms of your eviction. Sarah and Tommy slipped out the back door and ran for the barn. The metal box clutched against her chest like a talisman. Behind them, she could hear Jack's voice, calm and measured, as he met Garrison's demands. Gentlemen, Jack said through the front door, Mrs. Bennett isn't receiving visitors today. If you've got business, you can conduct it with me. Stand aside, Morrison. This doesn't concern you. Everything concerning this family concerns me. Jack's voice carried a note of steel that made Sarah's heart race with both fear and pride. And I'm thinking 4 armed men against 1 woman and her boy doesn't exactly qualify as fair business practices. The law's on our side here. Funny thing about the law, Jack replied. Sometimes what folks think is legal turns out to be anything but. Sarah reached the barn and quickly saddled her mare, lifting Tommy onto the horse's back before climbing up behind him. The metal box was secured in her saddlebags, along with a few essential supplies she kept ready for emergencies. "Where are we going, Mama?" Tommy whispered. "To see a lawyer in Austin, someone who can help us understand what Papa David left for us." Sarah urged the mare toward the back exit of the barn, staying in the shadows as much as possible. From the house came the sound of splintering wood, the front door being forced open. Sarah's heart lurched, but she forced herself to keep moving. Jack had bought them the time they needed. Now she had to make sure his sacrifice wasn't wasted. As they rode away from the ranch, staying to the creek bed and tree line to avoid being seen, Sarah could hear raised voices from the house. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was angry, threatening. She thought about Jack facing 4 armed men alone, about the courage it took to stand between danger and the people you loved. David had been brave too, but in a different way, quiet, steady, building for the future with careful planning and patient work. Jack's bravery was more immediate, more physical, the kind that put your body between a threat and everything you held dear. "Hold on tight, Tommy," she said, urging the mare into a faster pace. "We're going to save our home." The metal box bumped against her leg with each stride, a tangible reminder that David's love and foresight might yet triumph over Garrison's greed and violence. But first, they had to reach Austin alive. And Jack had to survive whatever was happening back at the house. As they rode toward an uncertain future, Sarah found herself praying to a God she'd sometimes doubted, praying for Jack's safety, for justice, and for the strength to see this fight through to the end. Behind them, Cedar Ridge grew smaller in the distance, but the sound of gunshots carried clearly across the open prairie. Sarah pressed her heels to the mare's sides and rode harder toward Austin, toward hope, toward whatever salvation David's final gift might provide. The law office of Samuel Hartwell occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building on Congress Avenue in Austin, its windows overlooking the bustling streets where cowboys, businessmen, and politicians mingled in the organized chaos of a growing city. Sarah sat across from the elderly lawyer, Tommy fidgeting beside her, as Hartwell examined David's documents with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 40 years reading territorial law. "Remarkable," Hartwell murmured, adjusting his spectacles as he studied the original survey maps. "Absolutely remarkable. Your husband was quite thorough in his research." "Is it legal?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with exhaustion and worry. They'd ridden hard for 18 hours, stopping only to rest the horse and buy Tommy something to eat. Every moment away from the ranch felt like a betrayal of Jack, who'd put himself in danger to give them this chance. Not only legal, but ironclad. Hartwell set down the territorial deed and looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. "Mrs. Bennett, according to these documents, you own approximately 15,000 acres in Brewster County, including mineral and water rights that extend far beyond what most people in your area realize." Tommy perked up at this news. "Does that mean we're rich, Mama?" "It means we're not losing our home," Sarah said softly, though her mind was racing with implications she was only beginning to understand. Hartwell leaned back in his leather chair, his expression thoughtful. "The question now is what Mr. Garrison knows about these claims and what he's been doing with that knowledge. Jack thinks he's been trying to acquire the land before we discovered the truth." Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, fighting off the chill that had little to do with the autumn air. "He's been buying up properties that legally belong to us, using fraudulent deeds. If that's the case, we're looking at conspiracy, fraud, and potentially theft on a massive scale." Hartwell gathered the documents into a neat pile. "I'll need to file these with the county clerk immediately and send copies to the territorial land office. But Mrs. Bennett, You should know men like Garrison don't give up easily when this much money is at stake. What are you saying? I'm saying your family may be in considerable danger until this matter is resolved through proper legal channels. Hartwell's expression was grave, and that process could take weeks, even months. Sarah thought of Jack facing Garrison's hired guns, of the gunshots she'd heard as they rode away from the ranch. We may not have weeks. Then we need to accelerate the process. Hartwell stood and reached for his coat. I'm going to take these documents directly to Judge Morisono, relation to your Mr. Morrison. I assume and request an emergency injunction. If we can get a court order freezing all property transactions in the affected area, it will stop Garrison from completing any additional fraudulent sales. While Hartwell hurried to the courthouse, Sarah and Tommy waited in the lawyer's office, watching the street below and trying not to think about what might be happening back home. Tommy had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted by the long ride and the adult tensions he didn't fully understand. Sarah found herself staring at her reflection in the window, seeing a woman she barely recognized. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a struggling widow facing foreclosure. Now she was potentially one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory, and the man she loved was possibly dead or in jail because of her family's unexpected fortune. The irony was bitter as medicine. David's careful planning and love had given them everything they needed to secure their future, but it might have cost them the future itself. A knock at the office door made her jump. She'd been expecting Hartwell to return, but the man who entered was unfamiliar, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Mrs. Bennett, I'm Judge Morrison. Mr. Hartwell asked me to speak with you directly. Sarah rose from her chair, careful not to wake Tommy. Your Honor, were you able to help us? I was, indeed. Judge Morrison's expression was serious but not unkind. I've issued a temporary restraining order freezing all property transactions in your area, pending a full investigation. I've also dispatched a deputy marshal to Cedar Ridge with orders to arrest anyone involved in fraudulent land dealings. Relief flooded through Sarah like cool water. Thank you, but what about the people who might be in danger right now? The marshal is authorized to use whatever force necessary to maintain order and protect citizens. Judge Morrison paused, studying Sarah's face. Mrs. Masty, Bennett, there's something else you should know. We've been investigating Mr. Garrison for some time, based on complaints from other areas where he's operated. Your documents provide the missing pieces we needed to build a case against him. Other areas. Garrison's been running this same scheme across 3 counties. Buy up property using fraudulent deeds, then foreclose on adjacent lands to consolidate large holdings for resale to railroad companies and mining interests. Judge Morrison's expression darkened. We estimate he's stolen close to 50,000 acres through these tactics. The scope of Garrison's crimes was staggering. Sarah thought of other families like hers, other widows and struggling ranchers who'd lost everything to this man's greed. What happens now, she asked. Now we return to Cedar Ridge and set things right. Judge Morrison tipped his hat. I'll be accompanying the marshal personally to ensure this matter is resolved properly. The return journey to Cedar Ridge took 2 days with Judge Morrison's entourage, U.S. Marshal, 2 deputies, and a court clerk authorized to witness whatever legal proceedings might be necessary. Sarah rode with Tommy in a borrowed buggy, her heart alternating between hope and terror as they drew closer to home. What would they find when they arrived? Was Jack alive? Had Garrison's men destroyed the ranch out of spite? Had the community rallied to support them, or had fear and intimidation silenced any potential allies? As they crested the final hill before Cedar Ridge, Sarah could see smoke rising from the direction of town. Not the scattered wisps of cooking fires and hearths, but the thick, dark smoke of something large burning. "Mama, what's that?" Tommy asked, pointing toward the distant column of smoke. "I don't know, sweetheart." But Sarah's heart was pounding with dread. Whatever had happened in their absence, it had been violent and destructive. Judge Morrison spurred his horse ahead to speak with the marshal, and Sarah could see them conferring in urgent, low voices. When Morrison returned to the buggy, his expression was grim. "Mrs. Bennet, there appears to have been some kind of incident in town. The marshal wants to proceed with caution." "What kind of incident?" "We'll know more when we get closer, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that things may have escalated beyond what any of us expected." As they approached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Sarah could see people gathered in small groups along the main street, their faces bearing the shocked expressions of citizens who'd witnessed something terrible. The smoke was coming from the ruins of what had once been the bank building, now a blackened shell with wisps of grey still rising from the debris. Sheriff Crawford met them at the edge of town, his face haggard and his usually neat uniform rumpled and stained with soot. "Judge Morrison," Crawford said, touching his hat brim. "Glad you're here. We've got a situation that's gotten way out of hand." "What happened, Sheriff?" Judge Morrison's voice carried the authority of federal law. "Garrison tried to force Mrs. Bennet's ranch hand to sign over power of attorney for the property. When Morrison refused, things got violent." Crawford's expression was grim. "Morrison barricaded himself in the house, and Garrison's men started shooting. Half the town heard the gunfight." Sarah's blood went cold. "Is Jackie's Mr. Morrison alive?" Crawford looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "He's alive, Mrs. Bennet, but he's in jail." "For what?" "For burning down the bank and shooting 2 of Garrison's hired guns." Crawford paused. "And for kidnapping Garrison himself." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Jack was alive, but he'd been driven to desperate measures to protect what was theirs, and now he faced charges that could send him back to prison for the rest of his life. "Where is he now?" she asked. "In my jail. And before you ask, no, I can't let you see him until this gets sorted out legally." Crawford's voice softened slightly. "But I can tell you he's not hurt bad, and he's been asking about you and the boy every hour since we locked him up." Judge Morrison stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Sheriff, I have federal authority to investigate fraud charges against Mr. Garrison. I'll need to speak with your prisoner immediately." "Yes, sir. But Judge, there's something else you should know." Crawford looked uncomfortable. "Garrison's dead." The simple statement seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Sarah felt the world tilt around her, everything she'd hoped for crumbling into ash and regret. "How?" Judge Morrison asked quietly. "Morrison says it was self-defense, says Garrison pulled a gun when he realized the game was up." Crawford shrugged. "Can't prove it either way, no witnesses except Morrison himself?" Sarah stared at the ruins of the bank, at the shocked faces of her neighbors, at the federal officers who'd come to deliver justice but might have arrived too late to save the man she loved. Jack had fought for their future, had risked everything to protect what David had left them. But the cost, the terrible cost, might be more than any of them could bear. "I need to see him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Bennet," Crawford began, "I need to see my husband." The word hung in the air between them, a claim and a declaration, and a desperate prayer all at once. Crawford looked between Sarah and Judge Morrison, clearly uncertain about the legal complexities of the situation. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "Sheriff, given the federal nature of this investigation and the extenuating circumstances, I'm authorizing Mrs. Bennet to see the prisoner. 10 minutes, under supervision." As they walked toward the jail, Sarah clutched Tommy's hand and tried to prepare herself for what she might find. Jack was alive, that was what mattered. Everything else could be dealt with, could be fought in court, could be overcome with time and patience and the truth. But first, she needed to look into his eyes and tell him that his sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that David's gift had saved them all, even if the cost of claiming it had been higher than anyone should have to pay. The jail door loomed ahead, heavy wood reinforced with iron, separating her from the man who'd become the center of her world. Whatever lay beyond that door, whatever legal battles and social consequences awaited them, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would fight for Jack Morrison the way he'd fought for her family, with everything she had, for as long as it took, until justice was served and they could finally build the life they dreamed of together. The jail cell was smaller than Sarah had expected, barely large enough for the narrow cot and wash basin that comprised its furnishings. Jack sat on the edge of the cot, his head in his hands, still wearing clothes that bore the stains of smoke and violence. When he looked up at the sound of her voice calling his name, Sarah saw relief and anguish war in his expression. "Sarah." He stood quickly, moving to the bars that separated them. "Tommy, thank God you're both safe." Sarah reached through the bars to touch his face, her fingers tracing the bruises and cuts that marked his ordeal. "What did they do to you?" "Nothing I couldn't handle." Jack caught her hand and pressed it to his cheek, his eyes closing briefly at the contact. "Did you get the documents to a lawyer? Are they safe?" "They're safe. We have a federal judge here and a marshal. The Territorial Land Office has copies of everything David left us." Sarah felt tears threatening. "Jack, you saved us. You saved everything." "At what cost?" Jack's voice was rough with self-recrimination. "I killed a man, Sarah. Whatever else happens, that's something we can't undo." Tommy pressed against the bars, his young face serious as he studied the man who'd become his hero. "Did you have to kill him, Mr. Jack?" Jack knelt down to Tommy's eye level, his expression gentle despite the pain Sarah could see beneath the surface. "He was going to hurt your mama, son. He had a gun, and he was going to use it to take away everything your papa worked for." "Then you did the right thing," Tommy said with the absolute moral clarity of childhood. "Papa always said a man protects his family, no matter what." Jack's eyes found Sarah's over Tommy's head, and she saw the weight of responsibility and regret he carried. This man who'd already sacrificed 5 years of his life for someone else's mistake had now been forced to take a life to protect what mattered most to him. "The judge says there's going to be an investigation," Sarah said quietly. "Federal charges against Garrison's whole operation. You won't face this alone." "Sarah," Jack began, but was interrupted by the sound of voices from the front office. Sheriff Crawford appeared, followed by Judge Morrison and a tall man wearing a marshal's badge. "Time's up, Mrs. Bennett," Crawford said, though his tone was respectful rather than harsh. "Judge Morrison needs to interview the prisoner." Sarah squeezed Jack's hand through the bars. "We'll be right outside. I'm not leaving without you." "Ma'am," the marshal said as Jack was led to Crawford's office for questioning, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened here." For the next hour, Sarah recounted everything she knew about Garrison's scheme, from the accelerated foreclosure demands to the discovery of David's hidden documents. The marshal listened with the patient attention of a man accustomed to separating truth from fabrication, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly letting her tell the story in her own words. "According to your statement," the marshal said when she finished, "Mr. Morrison was acting to protect you and your property from what amounted to armed robbery." "That's exactly what it was," Sarah said firmly. "Garrison brought 3 armed men to force us off our own land using fraudulent documents. The question is whether a jury will see it that way." Judge Morrison had emerged from his interview with Jack, his expression thoughtful. "Self-defense is a valid claim, but the circumstances are complex." "What did Jack tell you?" Sarah asked. "The same story you did, essentially. Garrison confronted him with an ultimatum sign, over power of attorney for the ranch or face the consequences. When Morrison refused, Garrison's men opened fire." Judge Morrison paused. "Morrison says he was trying to escape through the back of the house when Garrison cornered him with a pistol. There was a struggle, and the gun went off." "You believe him?" "I believe the evidence supports his account. The bullet that killed Garrison came from Garrison's own gun, fired at close range in what appears to have been a struggle for control of the weapon." Judge Morrison's voice carried the weight of legal authority. "More importantly, we found documents in Garrison's possession that prove he knew about the fraudulent nature of his land claims." Sarah felt a flutter of hope. "What kind of documents?" "Correspondence with land speculators in Austin and Dallas, discussing the resale of properties he hadn't legally acquired yet. Maps showing mineral survey results for your area. And most damning of all, a copy of your husband's territorial research that he'd obtained somehow. The implications were staggering. He knew all along that the land legally belonged to us. Not only knew, but was actively working to cover up that knowledge while forcing you into foreclosure. The marshal spoke for the first time in several minutes. Mrs. Bennett, your husband's documents don't just prove your claim to the land. They prove that Garrison was engaged in a criminal conspiracy to defraud you and other property owners. What does that mean for Jack? Judge Morrison exchanged a look with the marshal before answering. It means that Mr. Morrison was defending your family's property against what amounts to armed theft. Under territorial law, that's justifiable. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. He's going to be released? There'll need to be a formal hearing, but yes, I expect the charges will be dropped. Judge Morrison's expression grew serious. However, there's still the matter of the bank building and the violence that occurred in town. Some folks aren't going to be happy about the destruction, regardless of the legal justification. As if summoned by his words, a crowd began gathering outside the sheriff's office. Sarah could see familiar faces through the window, neighbors and townspeople, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Word of the day's events had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, and people wanted answers. Sheriff Crawford looked out at the growing crowd with obvious concern. Judge, maybe we should consider moving the prisoner to Austin until things cool down. No. Sarah's voice was firm. Jack stays here. This is his home now, and these people need to understand what really happened. Mrs. Bennett, the marshal said carefully, mob justice isn't something to take lightly. People are scared and angry, and they're looking for someone to blame. Then let's give them the truth. Sarah stood and moved toward the door. Let me talk to them. Sarah, no. Jack's voice carried across the office from where he sat, with his hands still shackled. These aren't your fights to fight. Yes, they are. Sarah turned to face him, her expression resolute. You fought for my family when I couldn't. Now I fight for you. She stepped out onto the sheriff's office porch, facing the crowd that had gathered in the street. There were perhaps 40 people, including Mrs. Henderson, the banker's widow, several ranch hands from neighboring properties, and townspeople she'd known for years. Their faces reflected the uncertainty and fear that came with violence and upheaval in a community that prized stability above almost everything else. Folks, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air, I know you're looking for answers about what happened today. You deserve the truth. Truth is your man killed Mr. Garrison and burned down the bank, called out Henderson, his face flushed with anger. Now you're hiding behind federal marshals to escape justice. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Sarah held her ground. Mr. Henderson, Mr. Garrison tried to steal my ranch using fraudulent documents. He brought armed men to force me off land that's been in my family for years. Jack Morrison defended that land the same way any of you would defend what's yours. Garrison was a banker, not a criminal, Mrs. Henderson protested, though her voice lacked conviction. He was both. Sarah pulled the original territorial deed from her apron pocket, holding it up for the crowd to see. This document proves that the land Garrison claimed to own legally belongs to my family. Has belonged to us since before most of you came to this valley. The crowd grew quieter as Sarah explained about David's research, about the hidden documents that proved the ranch's true boundaries, about Garrison's systematic fraud that had affected multiple counties. She spoke about water rights and mineral claims, about families who'd lost everything to a man who used the law as a weapon against honest people. I know some of you bought land from Mr. Garrison, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I know you're worried about what this means for your own properties, but stealing from my family won't make your titles any more legal. We need to work together to set things right. What about the violence? Called out someone from the back of the crowd. What about the blood spilled in our streets? Jack's voice came from behind her as he stepped onto the porch, his shackles removed, but a deputy still close at hand. That blood is on my hands, and I'll answer for it. But I won't apologize for protecting what's mine. The crowd's attention shifted to Jack, and Sarah could feel the tension ratchet higher. This was the moment of truth, whether the community would accept Jack as one of their own or brand him as an outsider whose violence had disrupted their peace. 5 years ago, I made mistakes that cost me everything, Jack continued, his voice steady and clear. "I've spent every day since trying to prove I was more than the worst thing I'd ever done. When I came to Cedar Ridge, Mrs. Bennett gave me a chance to work for something honest, something good. Today, when men came to steal that from her, I did what any husband and father would do." Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the lamplight. "Folks, I've investigated what happened here today. Mr. Morrison acted in self-defense against armed men who were attempting to force him off property that legally belongs to the Bennett family. The federal authorities have confirmed that Mr. Garrison was engaged in fraudulent land dealings. This wasn't murder, it was justice." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, the hostile energy gradually shifting to uncertainty and then to grudging acceptance. These were practical people who understood the difference between legal and illegal, between defending your home and committing murder. Finally, Old Man Patterson's nephew stepped forward. He was a soft-looking man from back east who'd inherited property he didn't understand and immediately sold to Garrison for cash. Now his face was pale with the realization of what he'd lost. "Mrs. Bennett," he said formally, "if what you're saying is true, then I sold Mr. Garrison land that wasn't legally mine to sell." "That's right," Sarah said gently. "But you didn't know. You trusted a man who presented himself as honest and law-abiding. What happens now?" Sarah looked at Jack, then at Judge Morrison, then back at the crowd of neighbors who would determine whether they could build a life in this place or would need to start over somewhere else. "Now we rebuild," she said simply. "We fix what's been broken, we help the people who've been hurt, and we make sure this never happens again." The formal hearing took place 3 days later in the Cedar Ridge Schoolhouse, the largest building in town capable of accommodating the crowd that had gathered to witness justice being served. Judge Morrison presided from behind the teacher's desk, while a court reporter from Austin documented every word for the territorial records. Jack sat at a small table with Sarah beside him, the original ranch deeds spread before them like a shield against the accusations that had threatened to destroy their future. Across the aisle, the federal prosecutor presented evidence of Garrison's fraud, while the marshal testified about the documents found in the dead banker's possession. "The evidence is clear," Judge Morrison announced after reviewing the final testimony. "Mr. Garrison was engaged in a systematic conspiracy to defraud multiple property owners through the use of falsified deeds and intimidation tactics. When confronted with proof of his crimes, he resorted to violence to protect his illegal scheme." Sarah felt Jack's hand tighten around hers as the judge continued. Mr. Morrison's actions, while regrettable in their outcome, were justified under territorial law as defense of property and family. The charges against him are hereby dismissed. The schoolhouse erupted in murmurs of approval and relief. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling a weight she'd carried for weeks finally lift from her shoulders. Jack was free, truly free, not just from the immediate charges, but from the shadow of his past that had followed him since his release from prison. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "However," he continued, his voice carrying the authority of federal law, "the matter of property rights in this area is far from resolved. Mrs. Bennett's territorial claim affects not just her own ranch, but multiple properties that have been bought and sold over the past several years." This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Yes, they'd proven their legal claim to the land, but that claim encompassed homes and farms where good people had invested their life savings based on deeds they'd believed were legitimate. Patterson's nephew stood up from his seat in the back of the schoolhouse. "Your Honor, what about those of us who bought property from Garrison? Are we just out of luck?" "The law recognizes the difference between innocent purchasers and knowing participants in fraud," Judge Morrison replied. "However, the resolution of these competing claims will require careful negotiation and, in some cases, compensation." Sarah rose to her feet, feeling the attention of the entire community focus on her. This was her chance to show what kind of neighbor she intended to be, what kind of person Jack had risked everything to protect. "Your Honor, if I may speak." Judge Morrison nodded. "Mrs. Bennett?" My husband left me documents that prove our family's claim to this land. But he also left me something more important, the knowledge that a community is only as strong as its weakest member. Sarah looked around the schoolhouse, meeting the eyes of neighbors she'd known for years. I'm not interested in throwing families off land they've worked and improved and called home. The tension in the room was palpable as people waited to hear what she would propose. I'd like to suggest a solution that honors both the law and the investments people have made in good faith, Sarah continued. For those who bought property from Garrison believing they were getting clear title, I propose we work out agreements that allow you to stay on your land while compensating my family for the legal ownership rights. Patterson's nephew looked surprised. What kind of agreements? Long-term leases with option to purchase at fair market value. Revenue sharing for any mineral rights that prove valuable. Water sharing agreements that benefit everyone. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she outlined her vision. The goal isn't to punish innocent people, it's to build a community where everyone has a stake in each other's success. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed by the proposal. Mrs. Bennett, you're suggesting essentially creating a cooperative land trust. I'm suggesting we do what neighbors should do, take care of each other. Sarah glanced at Jack, seeing pride and love in his expression. This valley has enough resources to support everyone if we're smart about how we use them. Over the next several hours, the details were worked out with the careful precision of people who understood that their future prosperity depended on getting the arrangements right. Water rights would be shared based on need and usage. Mineral rights would be developed cooperatively, with profits distributed among all the landholders. Agricultural cooperation would help everyone weather droughts and market fluctuations. Most importantly, a new bank would be established with local ownership and oversight, ensuring that no single person could again wield financial power as a weapon against the community. This is unprecedented, Judge Morrison observed as the agreements took shape. But it's also exactly the kind of innovative thinking the territory needs as we move toward statehood. As the hearing concluded and people began filing out of the schoolhouse, Sarah found herself surrounded by neighbors who had viewed her with suspicion just days before. Mrs. Henderson, her face softened by relief and gratitude, was among the first to approach. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," she said quietly, "and more than that, I owe you thanks. When I heard what really happened with Garrison, I realized how close we all came to losing everything. We're all learning, Margaret. What matters is that we move forward together." Jack stood beside the restored ranch deed, now properly filed and recorded with the territorial government. The document that had hidden in their kitchen wall for years was finally serving its intended purpose, protecting the family David had loved and providing security for the future he'd envisioned. Sheriff Crawford approached them as the crowd thinned. "Jack, I want you to know what you did took real courage. Lot of men would have run when things got dangerous." "I had something worth fighting for," Jack replied simply, his arms settling around Sarah's waist. "That you did." Crawford tipped his hat to Sarah. "Ma'am, your husband, both of them, would be proud of what you've accomplished here." That evening, as the three of them sat on the front porch of their ranch house, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in the space of a few weeks. The barn roof no longer leaked, the fences stood straight and strong, and the well ran clear thanks to Jack's hard work in restoring the creek flow. But more than the physical improvements, there was a sense of peace that had been missing since David's death. "Mama," Tommy said, looking up from where he sat on the porch steps with his wooden horse, "are we really going to be rich?" Sarah and Jack exchanged amused glances. "We're going to be comfortable, sweetheart, but more importantly, we're going to be a family." "Does that mean Mr. Jack is really my papa now?" Jack's throat worked for a moment before he could answer. "If that's what you want, son, if your mama's willing to make it official." Tommy launched himself into Jack's arms with the enthusiasm of a child whose world had suddenly become everything he'd dreamed it could be. "I want that more than anything." Later, after Tommy had been tucked into bed with promises of fishing trips and riding lessons and all the adventures a boy could want with a father who understood both work and play, Sarah and Jack sat together on the porch swing David had built during their first summer on the ranch. "Do you think he would approve?" Sarah asked quietly, her head resting on Jack's shoulder. "David, I think he'd approve of anything that made you and Tommy happy and kept this place in the family." Jack's voice was thoughtful. "Besides, seems like he planned it this way. Hiding those documents where you'd only find them if you were making the kind of improvements that suggested you planned to stay. You think he knew? Somehow knew that I'd find someone else?" "I think he knew you deserved to be happy. And he knew Tommy deserved to have a father who'd teach him about honor and hard work and taking care of what matters." Jack pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I just hope I can live up to what he'd want for his family." "You already have," Sarah said softly, "the moment you decided to fight for us instead of running away." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. In the distance, they could see lights from their neighbors' houses, the community they'd helped heal and strengthen, the people who'd become extended family through shared struggle and mutual support. "What happens now?" Jack asked. "Now we live the life David dreamed of and you fought for," Sarah replied. "We raise cattle and children, we help our neighbors prosper, and we prove that sometimes the best things come from the hardest struggles." Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 rings, the simple gold bands they'd chosen in town that afternoon, symbols of the commitment they were ready to make public and permanent. "Sarah Bennett," he said formally, sliding off the swing to kneel before her, "will you marry me? Not because we need to prove anything to anybody, but because I can't imagine a future without you and Tommy in it." Sarah looked down at this man who'd ridden into her life with nothing but a willingness to work for his meals and had ended up saving everything she held dear. The moonlight caught the gold of the rings, the same metal that had bound her to David and would now bind her to Jack in a different but equally precious way. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." As Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah felt the last pieces of her broken heart finally heal. Not erased, she would always carry her love for David, but transformed into something new and strong enough to hold both her past and her future. From Tommy's bedroom window came the soft sound of a child's contented breathing, and from the barn came the gentle nickering of horses settling in for the night. These were the sounds of home, of family, of a life built on love and defended with courage. Tomorrow they would begin planning their wedding, would start the legal processes that would make Jack officially Tommy's father, would work with their neighbors to build the cooperative community they'd envisioned. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but they would face them together. Tonight, though, they simply held each other on the porch of the house David had built and Jack had defended, watching the stars wheel overhead and feeling grateful for second chances and the courage to claim them. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the church steeple gold as the people of Cedar Ridge gathered for the wedding of Sarah Bennett and Jack Morrison. The small wooden building overflowed with neighbors, friends, and family who had come to witness the union of 2 souls who had found each other through adversity and love. Sarah stood before the mirror in the church's back room, adjusting the simple white dress she'd sewn herself with help from Mrs. Henderson and the other women in town. It wasn't the elaborate gown she'd worn when she married David. This dress was more practical, more suited to the life of a rancher's wife, but it felt right for the woman she'd become. "You look beautiful, Mama," Tommy said from where he sat on a wooden chair, his own new suit making him look far older than his 9 years. In his hands, he held the wedding rings, his responsibility as the man of honor weighing seriously on his young shoulders. "Thank you, sweetheart." Sarah knelt down to adjust his tie, marveling at how much he'd grown in the past months. The shy, worried boy who'd lost his father was blossoming into a confident young man under Jack's patient guidance. "Are you ready to make this official?" "I've been ready since the day Mr. Jack fixed my horse," Tommy said solemnly. "He's been my papa in everything but name for months now." A soft knock at the door announced Mrs. Henderson's arrival. "Sarah, dear, it's time." As they walked toward the main sanctuary, Sarah could hear the murmur of conversation from the assembled guests. Judge Morrison had agreed to officiate the ceremony, giving their union the weight of legal authority as well as spiritual blessing. Sheriff Crawford would serve as Jack's best man, a friendship born of mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. The doors opened, and Sarah felt her breath catch at the sight of Jack standing at the altar. He wore a new black suit, purchased with money from their first successful cattle sale, his dark hair neatly trimmed, and his face clean-shaven for the occasion. But what struck her most was the expression in his eyes, not just love, though that was certainly there, but a kind of peaceful contentment she'd never seen in him before. This was a man who had found his place in the world. As Sarah walked down the aisle on Tommy's arm, her son insisting on the honor of giving her away, she passed the faces of people who had become more than neighbors. They were family now, bound together by shared struggles and mutual support. Patterson's nephew nodded respectfully from his pew. Mrs. Henderson smiled through happy tears. Even the banker's widow, who had been among the most skeptical of Jack's character, watched with approval. "Dearly beloved," Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two people who have shown us all what it means to fight for love, to stand by each other through adversity, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss." The ceremony was simple but profound. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises that spoke not just of love but of partnership, of shared commitment to family and community, of building a legacy that would honor both the past and the future. "Do you, Sarah Elizabeth Bennett, take John William Morrison to be your husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better and for worse, for richer and for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, John William Morrison, take Sarah Elizabeth Bennett to be your wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better and for worse, for richer and for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Jack replied, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "And do you, Thomas David Bennett, accept John Morrison as your father, to honor and respect him as he has honored and respected you?" Tommy stepped forward with the seriousness of someone who understood the weight of the moment. "I do, and I want to be Tommy Morrison now, if that's okay." There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Jack knelt down to embrace his new son, the boy who had lost one father but gained another through love and choice rather than accident of birth. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife, and I have the honor to declare this family officially complete." Judge Morrison's voice carried satisfaction as well as authority. "Jack, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise for the years ahead. When they broke apart, the church erupted in applause and cheers, the sound of a community celebrating not just a wedding but the triumph of love over adversity. Later, at the reception held in the churchyard under strings of lanterns, Sarah found herself dancing with her new husband to the music of a fiddle band that had come from Austin for the occasion. The evening air was warm with the promise of summer, and the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Any regrets, Mrs. Morrison?" Jack asked, spinning her gently in his arms. "Just one," Sarah replied, smiling up at him. Jack's expression grew concerned. "What's that?" "I regret that we waited so long to make it official. I've been thinking of you as my husband for months now." Jack's relief was visible as he pulled her closer. "Well, we've got the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." As the evening wore on, Sarah watched Tommy dancing with some of the other children, his laughter carrying clearly across the yard. She saw their neighbors enjoying themselves, the same people who had once viewed Jack with suspicion, now treating him as one of their own. She saw Judge Morrison deep in conversation with several ranchers about plans for territorial statehood and the role their cooperative land trust might play in the new government. But mostly, she saw the future David had dreamed of, and Jack had fought for a community built on mutual support, a family bound by love rather than just blood, a legacy that would endure for generations. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, following her gaze around the celebration. "I'm thinking about how strange life is," Sarah replied. "6 months ago, I thought I was losing everything. Tonight, I feel like I have more than I ever dreamed possible. The land? The land, yes, but more than that." Sarah gestured toward Tommy, toward their celebrating neighbors, toward the life they'd built together. "I have a family again, a real family, chosen and fought for and earned." As the evening wound down and guests began heading home, Sarah and Jack stood together in the churchyard, watching the last of the lanterns flicker in the gentle breeze. Tommy had fallen asleep in a chair nearby, exhausted by the excitement and celebration. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Morrison?" Jack asked, scooping up their son with practiced ease. "I've been ready my whole life," Sarah replied, taking his free arm as they walked toward their waiting buggy. The ranch looked different in the moonlight, peaceful and prosperous under the starlit sky. The cattle grazed contentedly in pastures that had been carefully managed and improved. The barn stood straight and strong, its roof no longer leaking. The house glowed with warm lamplight from the windows, welcoming them home. As they carried Tommy inside and tucked him into his bed, the boy stirred long enough to mumble, "Night, Mama. Night, Papa Jack." Sarah felt her heart overflow at the simple words, "Papa Jack." It was what Tommy had been calling him for weeks now, but hearing it on their wedding night felt like a benediction, a blessing on the family they'd created through love and determination. Later, as she and Jack sat on their front porch, married now, officially and completely, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The pain of David's death would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the end of the story. The fear and uncertainty she'd felt when Jack first knocked on her door had been transformed into trust and partnership. "Do you think he knows?" she asked quietly, looking up at the stars. "David, I mean. Do you think he knows how things turned out?" Jack considered the question seriously, the way he approached everything that mattered to Sarah. "I think if there's any way for the dead to watch over the living, he's probably pretty satisfied with how his boy is being raised and how his land is being cared for. And with the man I chose to help me do both? I hope so. I try every day to be worthy of the trust he placed in me by loving you first." Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the calloused hands that had worked so hard to build their life together. This wasn't the same love she'd shared with David. It was deeper in some ways, harder won, tempered by struggle and loss, and the conscious choice to build something beautiful from broken pieces. "I love you, Jack Morrison," she said simply. "I love you too, Sarah Morrison, and I love the life we've built together." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, wild and free under the vast Texas sky. But here on their front porch, surrounded by the evidence of human love and determination, the thriving ranch, the sleeping child, the community they'd helped heal, Sarah felt nothing but peace. Sometimes the best endings were really beginnings. Sometimes losing everything was the first step toward finding what you were really meant to have. And sometimes a stranger who knocked on your door asking for nothing but work and food could end up giving you a future more precious than gold. The stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to promises kept and love freely given. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chapters in the story they were writing together. But tonight, Sarah Morrison sat with her husband on the porch of their home, listening to the peaceful sounds of a life well lived and a love well earned, and knew that she was exactly where she belonged.